Okay, thanks everyone. So we've covered a lot of ground with this day and a half, and so this will be hopefully a useful way to conclude it, is talking about grants and writing grants and ideas. And I was talking with a few people at the start that I certainly don't claim to have all the expertise here. There's many people here who have been involved with grants, writing grants. Please feel free to add to what I'm going to say. I'm going to go through this so we are able to end at 12. And then just a few closing remarks. So then we can have lunch, which will be just down the hallway. Okay. So this is my disclosures, just to be very transparent and no connections really to for-profit entities, and very fortunate to receive funding from public sources. So as many of you know, really we're here in big part because of having this trial funded, which was funded by CIHR Health Canada and with strong support from the Public Health Agency of Canada. There are a number of members of the team here and co-principal investigators. It was a kind of an unprecedented $10 million grant to do this specific study. It came about really in part because of a strong kind of advocacy by the Public Health Agency, where they were talking with people in the field, us and colleagues in infectious disease and public health, and saying, really, we're spending a lot of money on these medications. How do we know they're going to work? How do we develop that? And before the pandemic and in the first few years of the pandemic, many Canadian academics had been saying, we need adaptive platform trials. We need this. This is the perfect opportunity. Colleagues did try to, and they did submit proposals to CIHR at the early stage of the pandemic for adaptive platform trials to actually fit with things like Principle and others, and they weren't funded. And I think this has to do a bit with reviewers and the community's awareness of adaptive platform trials, which over the 3 years of the pandemic, thankfully improved a lot and grew to where when the Public Health Agency went to CIHR and said, we need an adaptive platform trial, we need this to be evaluated, they quickly, within a few weeks, were able to create a funding opportunity, go through that. We submitted and we were successful with this. One of the other kind of key pieces I'll just mention is, I think a key ingredient of our success was that the community and those of us who are involved in it were really willing to work together and come to a consensus that this really should be embedded in primary care settings, where the vast majority of COVID at that point, this is in early 2022, was being seen, and that this really should be about building our capacity as well in primary care research. So part of what Can Treat COVID has now led to is something called the Canadian Primary Care Trials Network. This was launched just this past April, and it's very much inspired by things like the Oxford Clinical Trials Unit and other trial networks around the world. And we hope that it will be under the umbrella of the Canadian Primary Care Research Network as a specific kind of group within it around trials. And you can find out more at primarycaretrials.ca. So in terms of why do this and why try to build a trial network within primary care, of course, many RCTs are conducted that don't represent the broad diversity of patients and in contexts that are very different than general practice, where most of the treatment will happen. And although it's hard to actually get the data, only a small percentage of CIHR funding is actually going to faculty in primary care. And most trials that come to primary care are led by people outside of primary care who are mostly focused on recruitment. So we want to really turn this into a system that's building capacity as well. And so I mentioned this just as you're thinking of writing grants for adaptive platform trials, to think about practice-based research networks. It was interesting to hear about the Oxford experience and building a hub and spoke model for panoramic and kind of the benefits of that. This is a very similar idea. And this idea of the Canadian Primary Care Trials Network is emerging from many years of work, over a decade of experience in Canada, creating practice-based research networks. There's a few colleagues in the room who help lead or are heavily involved with their own local networks as well. I'm a bit biased in this because I just recently, as of September 1st, took on the role of being the director of our University of Toronto Practice-Based Research Network, which engages about 400,000 patients and includes over 1,000 faculty. So we're really excited as we're evolving and kind of moving into this space. And of course, these are meant to be laboratories for discovery. They're networks of organizations. They don't have to be primary care. In fact, the first practice-based research networks were really in places like cancer, cardiovascular disease. They can also be whole entities like local public health. I'm a public health specialist like Ross, as well as a family doc. And I've been talking with our colleagues in public health about what would it look like if we had a practice-based research network across public health units. And we could do really amazing work and actually study things that are at a population level. Like, what's the best way to engage people to get their COVID vaccine? And doing that in a trial across multiple health units. Of course, it's about working cooperatively to address pragmatic questions. There's a shared commitment around systemic inquiry, and there's central coordination and efficiencies that can happen. Again, I'm mentioning this as you're starting to envision writing that next grant for an adaptive platform trial. So the objectives here, I'll just skip to this, are to really look at the key, sorry, this is like a little bit tricky, reviewing the key components of a grant application, identify critical success failure factors and some challenges, and help actually by the end of this that you could have a rough outline for a grant application. And also, if we have time, kind of just touch on some of the parts of a master protocol. So just some reminders about key items for any grant are, of course, this is just practical kind of ideas that emerge from many years of doing grants. And I'm sure you all have things that you could add to this, but start by assembling a small team to help with the application, including staff who are going to help you by keeping track of admin items so that you can focus on the content. As early as possible, have the team, that small team, read through the instructions in detail and develop a Gantt chart. What are the tasks? What are the deadlines? Review your institutional requirements. Many institutions have to sign off on grants or have mandatory peer review or a review of the budget. Reach out to people very early. And I'm really glad this is following the discussion around community engagement. And it was great to actually learn about that work at the WHO. But, reach out to people very early to let them know you're planning this, what are their thoughts, and to start to build out your team. Try to assemble all the parts a couple weeks before and upload them. And if you have the capacity, engage additional staff with expertise in budgets, patient and community engagement, graphic design that could add and help with that application. So a couple of big picture items to keep in mind as you're writing this, and I find this is helpful to actually use a whiteboard to actually go through these questions and answer them like you're making an elevator pitch to the head of the funding institution. What is this? Why is this really important? And why is it more important than numerous other conditions? We get so focused into our own area, but how are you going to make the case that's really more important than other things that are happening? What's the scale of the problem? Make sure you know how many people are impacted, the lives lost, the disability, the cost. What's the urgent need for this? Is it in the context of an emergency like a pandemic, or is it a growing issue? Why have past treatments failed, or is there an absence of data? And showing and demonstrating that communities and policymakers are supportive is so key, that you can stand up and honestly say, this is emerging from the community. This is something that I've heard from providers, from patients, from community members. Why is this urgently needed now? I think many grant proposals that go in are fantastic on the science, but they just are not conveying the urgency that this is urgently needed now, compared, and that it's that sense of urgency that often gets things funded. Why is an adaptive platform trial by far the best methodology to use, and really being confident in your argument for that? And why are you and your team absolutely the best people to conduct this work, including, are you collaborating with, people in this room who are world experts on your study? And of course, many reviewers may not be familiar with adaptive platform trials. Define it early in the grant, point to existing examples and how they've been impactful. I think it helped us to say, during the pandemic, attack, recovery, and others have really shaped what we know. So this is really helpful. And remember, and I'm not going to reiterate what we've talked about yesterday, but adaptive platform trials are particularly useful when we're talking about multiple possible treatments, new arms that can be added as evidence emerges, that there are multiple centers that are going to be involved with this, all coordinated, and there's rapidly changing circumstances and evidence. So also think about this question of how can your adaptive platform trial take advantage of routine clinical care and actually be embedded in health systems, and that whole idea of them as being integrated as part of a learning health system as well. And this is just a figure that kind of shares, what do we mean by a learning health system, where we have information and identifying problems coming in, designing interventions, implementing, evaluating, and then adjusting in a continuous process. And in Canada, we're fortunate that the Canada has really adopted this idea of a learning health system, and a lot of the grants now actually have in them saying, how is this going to contribute to a learning health system? So just some key components, and I'm using CIHR just because we're based here in Canada, but I think this is applicable to many countries as well. So the first section is it's really broken into 3 parts. The first being, what's the need for the trial and why an APT? So being clear about what's a summary. A really helpful thing is at the very start of your proposal, having 4 or 5 sentences that capture everything that you're going to be talking about, so that the reviewer right at the start is, if they skipped your 1-page summary and they skipped your abstract, they're oriented right to what you're going to do. But then getting into what's the problem, why you're focusing on a condition or a situation. And I want people to kind of think about adaptive platform trials could be used not only for treatments, but for things like policy interventions or other types of things. What's the objective and principal questions? Why now? Again, that idea of the urgency. And of course, if you've done, or colleagues on your team have done, a systematic review of the evidence, it's very powerful. We've looked at the evidence. There's nothing. This is really needed. How are the results going to be used? And making this link to guidelines or practice development or policy or communities directly, that we on our team, we have these people, they're going to take what we learn immediately. It's going to be like a conveyor belt right into the guideline development process. So thinking about in your country, who's creating the guidelines? In Canada, we have something called the Canadian Preventative Care Task Force, which routinely is looking at the evidence and issuing guidelines, mostly for primary care. We of course have guideline development in many different areas: infectious disease, cardiology, cancer, and so on. And so reach out to those folks early and say, come join our team in this. And then of course talking about risks as well. Here's some actual wording from our grant. And part of our rationale for why a COVID outpatient therapeutics adaptive platform trial was needed, that kind of summarizing that people are faced with these 3 challenges. All the studies up until that point were pretty much in unvaccinated people, and it was unclear whether the existing therapeutics are going to work. They haven't been compared to one another. That's a really important and useful thing with adaptive platforms: head-to-head comparison. And no therapeutic at that time had been evaluated specifically for it reducing long COVID. We also included this kind of table, which kind of points out to the reviewer that there are some studies that have been done relatively, what were the limits, but also the huge costs that we estimated for some of these medications and why, this would be really a good investment to study these types of things and to say, which of these medications is going to be the best and most cost effective. And this is actually how your application is being evaluated. Are you talking about the present and future resource implications? Have you been really clear with your hypotheses and objectives? Is the trial actually addressing the right questions? And is this the right time? Are the reasons really and the changes that are going to be implemented very clearly explained? What's the evidence? And is it compatible with what we know already and the impact? Have you explained that? And also, will the results be generalizable? Because people really don't like to see you're going to do a single study trial in a specific area and they happen to be based in another part of the country. They're wondering, is this going to be really relevant to me? And I always say that to folks, although Toronto, we're a big city, and Ontario is 40% of Canada in terms of population. We have to be thinking about the whole country, and we have to be thinking that your grant is going to be reviewed by people probably outside of your jurisdiction. And so take that into account. In terms of the trial, so we, having this very clear right at the start, also as part of your preparation should just be kind of one of the key things. And you can put this into a nice little box right at the start of your method section. So this is now section 2. This is from our grant for Cantree COVID, spelling out exactly what the population is, the intervention, the control outcome, and primary and secondary outcomes. Now, this has evolved since we've actually got the funding, wrote the protocol, got underway, but it just gives you a sense. And also just a little point with adaptive platform trials, the reviewers really need to see what you're going to do, it seems. They really struggle if you just say, we're going to fund, we want funding to set it up. But they need to sort of see what's the arm, what are you going to be actually studying? So even if it's not confirmed, in this case, like putting down, it was going to be Paxlovid, which is our initial arm, putting that down is really, really important. So these are the specific sections, what's the proposed trial design? What will that look like? What are your interventions? And again, even though if many treatments may be tested, it's going to be important to talk about a couple of items. What are the proposed practical arrangements? How are you going to randomize people? And I'll show you a simple figure that will help with that. How are you going to address potential bias? And what are your inclusion and exclusion criteria? Again, you can imagine you could take this type of framework and start to put in all the details on that whiteboard, and that's going to be your draft grant. This is a figure we included with our proposal just to make it very simple to understand and see. We're going to be recruiting from a bunch of different places. We have provincial hubs that do the consent and data collection. We have stratified permuted block randomization and kind of how people are going to be allocated, and that we're not specifying all the arms. We knew we were going to start with Paxlovid, but we actually still have the decision to add and other arms. And then what's follow-up gonna look like? And this is also some wording from our grant, where we talked about how we're going to tackle the issue of bias in an open label, non-placebo controlled study. So being really upfront with that, anticipating that reviewers are going to kind of take issue with, this is an open label study, which the participants will know what they're getting, and you're not using a placebo. So we recognize that. But the trial team's going to be blinded, and we will have the data safety and monitoring committee, which will be unblinded for safety reasons. And trying to make the point that because it's pragmatic, that it helps with external validity, we're going to collect information about contamination, We're going to mitigate attrition bias by keeping people engaged. So it's important to think that there are there's over 100 different types of biases, and you can put wording into your application about how you're going to consider this, how you're going to tackle that. So, of course, talked about what's going to be the duration of treatment. Yesterday, it was really interesting, the discussion from colleagues with Together trial around the matching on the number of days. And I do hope they publish that and write that up, because it'll be great to cite that type of thing, that actually if we are doing placebo control, that there's not really a benefit to matching on the number of days. What's the frequency and duration of follow-up? What's your outcomes and why? Did you choose these, because they came from patients and communities, or policymakers or providers? So how did you decide on that, and what was your rationale? I feel like this is one of the most common areas that gets critiqued, is you chose some outcome measure, your reviewer doesn't really like it, it's a kind of a very esoteric tool, and then they kind of mark you down for that. And also, is it feasible? How feasible is it to collect this data? Have you maybe demonstrated through a pilot study or your previous work that you can collect this data? It's really neat to hear about the details from the UK about how they've used, different data collection processes, how that's worked, and just being able to demonstrate that that's going to be feasible. The sample size calculation, we had a great session yesterday, just talking this through from a number of perspectives, and the role of simulations as part of your application process. So now that you've attended this event, you are coming away with more knowledge and maybe even the code to do that, and to be able to say, look at Appendix X, of our application. We've actually thought through a number of different scenarios, and we're going to use these simulations as part of adjusting our sample size. And of course, thinking about things like non-compliance, loss to follow-up as well, and if you've done any pilot study. This is actually some wording from our grant, where we included that kind of somewhat traditional table of saying, if you have this amount of power, this is what it could look like. And we did have a caveat, which kind of gives us an escape clause that's saying, when we're ready to start, we're going to update this. We're going to do further simulations to really update this. And what we provide is the best available to date. So if between the time you submit and the time that the reviewer is looking at it, that there's some change, you can always say, well, it was good up to this point, and this is a rapidly evolving situation. So a few other areas are you thinking about health services use? Are you collecting information that's going to allow for a cost effectiveness study, and including that, and ideally having a health economist on your team? What's your recruitment rate, and how are you going to engage people? Again, for primary care sightings, think about practice-based research networks and past work that's been done. Are there going to be issues with compliance? What's going to be your loss to follow-up rate, and how many centers will ultimately be involved? We also included actual example recruitment materials, just to really make it seem real to the reviewers. Of course, these will be modified if we get the funding, and we'll go through research ethics, but just so that they can really kind of see you are ready to do this study. You've thought about it, and this is what it could look like. And this is actually what our recruitment materials now look like. And I wanted to share this because I found that often there's huge variation when it comes to local site investigators. And what we're trying in Canada is actually to have kind of a national standard of what is the responsibility of the principal investigator and then the local site investigators, who we really want them to be engaged with the process. They have certain responsibilities, like around dealing with local REB, local engagement, contracts, managing finances, and things like that. So we want to make this more tangible, and this could be an appendix to your application, as saying, We've thought this through. In every site that we're engaging, we're going to make sure that they go through this and it's very clear, and that they're going to be engaged as co-authors on the papers, and gain that kind of academic ability as well. I think also reviewers respond to this idea of capacity building as well, and ensuring you're doing it in an honest way, that you are really seeing this as a chance to engage more people in the research process. So there's again, we've over the last couple of days, we talked more about analyses and the frequency of analyses. I think a unique part with adaptive platform trials, of course, is explaining the interim analyses and the role of that. And that we're going to be doing it after this period of number of participants or this period of time, and the rationale around that. Are there any planned subgroup analyses? And this is where talking about equity considerations and sex and gender analysis is really important. There are often multiple points in the grant where you need to put that in. This is one of those key areas where you can say, we're really thinking about this, we're considering it, and this is what it will look like. And have you done any pilot study? I think this is also, if you haven't done a pilot study, where you could point to, we have people on our team who have done this in other contexts, and we're going to be leveraging that as well. So some of the things that will be evaluated in this second section is the design appropriate, have the people consider generalizability and representativeness. Is there a clear justification for the power calculations? Are the outcomes very clearly described? You should have a table which is at these different time points, we're going to use these different tools. Has the population been defined? And the measures validated? Is the control group appropriate? And have you thought about bias as well? The final and third section is the shortest. Often it's around the management. What's going to be the day-to-day management? Who's going to do what? We heard in Dr. Yu's presentation a bit about committees that they have, and actually I really like that very complex diagram of the statistical analysis and who's going to be doing what. What's the role of different people, and describe this data safety and monitoring committee. I'll just jump ahead to make this real. This is how we've set up CAN Treat COVID. We have a steering committee that's made up of the co-principal investigators. We have a statistical analysis committee, which was much more active early on, which was kind of our methods and statistics group. And thankfully, as we got consensus, it's been able to kind of like shift down. We have a very active recruitment and communications committee. We have a patient and community advisory group that's grown over time, and Jillian has played a big role with that. We have a therapeutics committee, which is kind of interesting, and I'd be interested to hear if this works for others, where essentially we have a group of people who's continually looking at the evidence and evaluating it and making decisions on treatment arms, which are then recommended to the steering committee. And we have our data safety and monitoring committee. Just to go back to how will this be evaluated? Obviously, does the team have the range of disciplines and experience? I think, it's really, adaptive platform trials are well suited for having diversity of ideas and backgrounds, everything from the biostatistics background to kind of the classic kind of trialist background, to ethics expertise and community engagement, to folks who are really good with recruitment and things like that. Do you have experience with multi-center trials? Have you incorporated the statistical advice, and do you have that on the team? And also, has there been thought about other health services issues? And can you really make it real how the trial is going to be coordinated as well? And this is a picture that we included in our grant of our team. Lots of people. We decided to break it up into areas so they could also be seen that, we have people now. People actually are in multiple kind of areas. Some people are both like primary care and biostatistics, or primary care and public health, or infectious disease. But we just kind of slotted people into one area just so that it can make sense. But people are not going to review this in detail, but it just gives a picture. You have a great group of people kind of here. Just to end on some key challenges, I think
Is this problem important and will it resonate with reviewers who are probably not in your area? Have you really thought about recruitment, which of course is the biggest challenge to every trial and also adaptive platform trials? If you can really convey you've thought about that and you have some great ideas of how to embed this into the health system, it will help. Building your team really quickly, identify site investigators as co-applicants and ask for letters of support. Make sure you have experienced team members, but you also want learners and early career researchers who are going to really be building capacity, and also make sure you budget for graduate students. Make sure you have knowledge users, particularly policymakers, but also colleagues who are not maybe research focused, but bring that, specific area of expertise. Obviously, statistical and health economic supports as well. Just some other tips. Make sure your summary is very clear. I think we all tend to leave it maybe to the end, but really spending time, because I think most reviewers will start with that. Let me just get a sense of what these folks are proposing. Try to weave sex and gender-based analysis throughout, and that you really are thinking about those kind of equity considerations. Consider that technical or preliminary data in an appendix where maybe you've done the simulations. Make sure your budget is reasonable. I think often reviewers get sticker shock if they see, oh, this looks like a great idea, but you're proposing like this amount of money for it. So really, work with your team and with your institution to say, is this feasible? And of course, make sure that you give yourself leeway, because the unexpected will happen. You'll face delays and stuff like that. Be careful with just the formatting, because sometimes we can go overboard with these things. And then read the peer review manual, like really read that and provide that to internal peer reviewers ahead of time. So I'll stop there and really welcome any questions.